Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown Watches the Final Hour, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown faces deadly deception. The corpse opened its eyes. For a fraction of a second, long enough to make even the seasoned doctor recoil, the dead man lying on the flagstones beneath the chapel window stared back with a gaze so filled with terror that those who saw it swore it had not been the reflex of a corpse, but the deliberate warning of a soul. Interrupted. Father Brown was the only one who did not step back, though he did grip the edge of his umbrella so tightly that the knuckles whitened. The little priest knew, as surely as he knew the shape of a cross, that nothing about this death would follow the lines of reason or order, and the deception lurking here would claim more than one life before the truth could even be whispered. The village, normally a quiet patch of English countryside with hedgerows hemming in sheep and cottages, was already swollen with rumors by the time the police arrived. Whispers rose like smoke. Some swore the victim had been heard singing a hymn only minutes after he fell. Others claimed to have seen a figure vanishing into the churchyard shadows, though no footprints marred the soft ground. Father Brown listened, patient as always, though his small eyes behind the spectacles darted from face to face. He was not listening to their words so much as to the way they trembled over them. He sensed already that deception was layered deep, deception so deadly it would destroy even the innocent who dared to look too closely. The body itself was a paradox. The man had fallen, it seemed, from the church window, a 30-foot drop that should have broken bones, yet his limbs were strangely unscathed. His neck bore no mark, but his eyes, those terrible eyes that had opened after death, were glassy, with a horror that had not faded in death's stillness. When Father Brown bent close, he noticed something odd, the faintest trace of candle wax on the victim's collar, as though he had been kneeling at prayer moments before his fall. But no candle was missing from the church, no wax trail marked the flagstones, and no one admitted seeing him enter the chapel at all. The inspector muttered about suicide, about confusion in the mind, about a man leaning too far out of the window. Yet Father Brown only nodded absently. His mind was moving through darker corridors, lit only by the faint gleam of conscience. A man might fall, yes, but he would not fall with the look of a hunted animal. That look belonged to someone who had been forced to see something he was never meant to see. And that, Father Brown thought grimly, was the beginning of deadly deception. What disturbed him most was the silence of the villagers who stood too close, who lingered not out of sympathy, but with the stillness of people guarding secrets. The baker's hands, dusted with flour, trembled when the inspector asked him the hour he had last seen the victim. The vicar's wife crossed herself, 3 times more than her faith required, as though smothering her own memory. Even the sacristan, normally loud with gossip, had retreated behind lips pressed thin. Father Brown could feel their lies pressing against him like invisible hands. When night fell, he returned alone to the church. It was silent except for the creak of the wooden beams, and in that stillness he whispered a prayer, though his prayer was more a question. Lord, what lies hide themselves in your house? And as if in Answer. The faint smell of smoke reached his nose. Not the sharp scent of wood burning, but a cloying, sickly odor, as though paper had been half burned, then smothered. He followed it to the vestry, where the ash in the grate still glowed faintly. He knelt, prodded with the tip of his umbrella, and saw the charred remnants of a letter. A single word clung to the edge of the ruined page. Forgive. Forgive who? Forgive what? The priest's heart sank with the knowledge that forgiveness here was not sought for accidents, but for sins too terrible to confess openly. The deception deepened. The following day, he questioned those closest to the dead man. A schoolteacher swore she had seen him arguing with someone in the churchyard, yet when pressed, she faltered, could not name who it was, and finally insisted it must have been a dream. A farmhand admitted the victim had come to him 3 nights ago, pale and shaken, muttering that he had been shown something that would damn the village. And then the man shut his mouth, as if a rope had been drawn tight around his throat. Father Brown knew the look. It was the look of someone terrified not merely of punishment, but of a truth so dangerous it could swallow everyone whole. And still, the corpse haunted him. The memory of those eyes opening after death gnawed at his thoughts like a rat in the dark. Could the man have still been alive, barely clinging, at the moment they thought him dead? If so, what had he tried to say with that gaze? Or was the deception even deeper? A trick staged, not by nature, but by human cruelty. Father Brown could not answer, but his soul told him one thing. The victim had been silenced, and the silence was not natural. The first reveal came not from evidence, but from the quietest of mouths. An old woman, nearly blind, confessed she had been walking near the church that night. She heard a man scream, not from falling, but from within the chapel itself. And then she said she heard singing, a hymn, clear as any choir, Dies Irae, the hymn of judgment. But no one else claimed to hear it. When Father Brown asked who was singing, the old woman only shook her head and whispered, "The dead sing truer than the living." Now nothing could be trusted, not the testimony, not the silence, not even the senses of those present. The inspector dismissed her words as the babble of age, but Father Brown felt his skin prickle. A hymn of judgment, sung on the night of a man's death? That was no accident. That was a message. But from whom? And for whom? Days passed, and the mystery thickened until the villagers themselves began to unravel. Whispers turned into accusations. Neighbors no longer met each other's eyes. The baker closed his shutters. The sacristan vanished entirely for 2 nights. The vicar's wife was found weeping in the garden. At dawn, her hands stained with ink. Every soul carried the weight of something concealed, and Father Brown realized the deception was not merely one man's lie, but a tapestry woven by the entire community. Somewhere in its threads was the truth, but to pull it free might destroy them all. One stormy evening, as thunder shook the old church, Father Brown returned to the vestry and found a second letter, half-burned like the first, hidden beneath the coal. It was written in a trembling hand, and though most was unreadable, one line remained intact. "I did not kill him, but I know who did." The priest stared at those words, his face unreadable. The deception had grown darker still. Not only murder, but a murderer hidden among the flock, and another, perhaps guilty, perhaps innocent, trying to smother the truth before it was too late. And then came the most shattering discovery of all. In the dead man's pocket, overlooked until now, lay a fragment of cloth, black, scorched at the edges, smelling faintly of incense. Not the cloth of his own garments, but of a robe used in the church, worn by someone who had stood at the altar, someone who was trusted to carry the mysteries of heaven. The implication was unbearable, almost blasphemous, for if it were true, then the deception reached into the very heart of the sanctuary, and the killer was cloaked not only in fabric, but in faith itself. Father Brown pressed the cloth to his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And when he spoke those words, it was not because he lacked certainty, but because he saw too clearly what would follow: scandal, ruin, souls driven not to salvation, but to despair. Some truths, he knew, are heavier than lies, and to speak them aloud might be the deadliest deception of all. The storm raged outside, rattling the stained glass windows, while inside the little priest stood alone in the shadows, holding the fragment of cloth that condemned a soul he might never reveal. Somewhere in the night, a voice seemed to whisper back the words burned into ash. Forgive. But forgive who? The murderer? The deceiver? Or Father Brown himself, for carrying a truth he could never share? The mystery remained, darker than before, a riddle without resolution, a silence more terrible than confession. And as the thunder rolled away into the distance, the chapel seemed to breathe with secrets that no living man should ever try to uncover. Would you like me to continue building this chapter out fully to the 3,500-word mark with more layered psychological tension, red herrings, and hidden motives among the villagers, stretching the suspense so that each new paragraph deepens the sense of overwhelming deception until the reader or viewer feels they cannot go on? Chapter 2. The Secret Murder. Father Brown uncovers. The dead man was never supposed to be found, and yet there he lay beneath the roots of the yew tree, staring upward as though his last sight had been not heaven, but hell itself. His throat had been cut so cleanly that the villagers whispered it could not have been done by human hands, and yet Father Brown, standing silently with his umbrella pressed against the damp earth, knew at once that what they faced was not an accident, not suicide, not even a crime of passion. It was a murder wrapped so carefully in secrecy that to uncover it would mean peeling back the very skin of the village. The shocking part was not that a man had been killed, but that his death had been hidden so deliberately for so long by those who should have wept for him. The inspector stammered something about poachers, about strangers who might have slipped through the hedgerows, but the villagers avoided each other's eyes. This was no work of strangers. There was no forced entry into the churchyard, no marks on the gate, no unfamiliar boot prints in the soil. The ground told its tale. The body had been lowered, not dragged. The earth disturbed only by familiar shoes, worn smooth at the sole. Whoever had buried him here had done so with a terrible calm, as though they had not feared discovery, as though they believed no one would ever look beneath the tree that had shaded generations of mourners. And yet Father Brown looked because he always looked where no one else dared. The mystery was immediately tangled with contradictions. The dead man had been missing for months, yet his body bore marks too fresh, wounds too recent to belong to a corpse so long concealed. His face was pale, but not with the grey stillness of decay. He looked as though he had been killed only yesterday, though every villager swore they had not seen him for weeks. It was impossible. Time itself seemed to have lied. The little priest frowned, for he knew the dead do not conspire to deceive. Only the living do. The widow, pale and trembling, declared her husband had left home on a journey weeks ago, but Father Brown noticed how her hands shook not with grief, but with something sharper, guilt, perhaps, or fear. When he asked her what her husband had been carrying that night, she hesitated before answering, and then said softly, "Nothing." But the villagers remembered differently. Some whispered of a locked box he had always kept close, a box no one had seen since. He vanished. Others spoke of papers, documents that might have ruined reputations if they came to light. Father Brown stored each whisper away like a puzzle piece, though no picture yet formed. At the coroner's examination, another disturbing fact emerged. The blade that cut the man's throat had been sharp, too sharp. Not a knife from a farm, not a tool of a workman, but something ceremonial, precise, almost delicate, a blade not meant for animals, but for rituals. The inspector laughed at the suggestion, but Father Brown's mind darkened. Ritual meant intention. Intention meant deception, on a level deeper than mere murder. He began to visit the villagers one by one, listening more than speaking, searching for the cracks in their words. The schoolteacher spoke kindly of the man, but would not meet Father Brown's gaze. The blacksmith declared no one would dare touch him, yet his hammer arm trembled as though weighted with memory. The sacristan, the same man who had disappeared for nights during the first case, insisted he knew nothing, but the priest saw flecks of earth beneath his nails, earth the color of the yew's roots, and still no one spoke the truth. It was as though the whole village had entered into a pact of silence, bound not by loyalty, but by terror. One night, as rain lashed the windows of the presbytery, Father Brown sat alone with a candle and read through the parish records. It was there, in the neat script of the ledger, that he found the first undeniable sign of deceit. The dead man's name had been scratched out, not once, but twice. Not merely a clerical error, but an act of erasure. Someone had tried to wipe him away, not only from the earth, but from memory itself. Father Brown touched the ink, still faintly smudged, and murmured, "The dead do not erase themselves." The following evening, he returned to the graveyard and found something even more disturbing. At the base of the yew, where the earth had been freshly turned, a second hole had been dug, smaller, narrower, as though intended for something not human. And in that hole, hastily covered, lay fragments of parchment, burned at the edges, and a rosary snapped clean in two. Father Brown knelt in the mud, his heart sinking. The rosary was not the dead man's. It belonged to someone who had prayed in that church every day, someone trusted, and it had been broken, deliberately. When he carried the fragments back inside the chapel and laid them beneath the light, the words that remained on the parchment chilled him to the marrow. It must never be known. That was all. No name, no confession, no plea. Just that one command. Father Brown sat in silence, staring at the blackened words, and whispered, "But why not?" The first great reveal came unexpectedly. A child, no more than 8, tugged at the priest's sleeve during morning mass and said, "I saw him after he died." When pressed, the child explained she had woken in the night and looked through her window at the churchyard. There, under the yew tree, she had seen not the man himself, but a figure bent over him, whispering into his ear, as though speaking to a corpse that could still hear. It was like they were confessing, the girl whispered, but the dead man didn't answer back. Father Brown's blood ran cold. If the child spoke truth, then not only was the man murdered, his death had been made part of some dark, secret ritual, a confession not to God, but to the silence of the grave. The village grew restless. Fear crackled in the air like a storm waiting to break. Every day brought fresh unease, windows barred early, shutters slammed tight, whispers growing louder. The inspector muttered of mass hysteria, but Father Brown knew better. Fear was a mask, and behind it, guilt twisted in the hearts of more than one villager. He returned once more to the widow's house, this time unannounced. In the dim light of her parlor, he noticed a box tucked half-hidden beneath a chair. It was old, iron-bound, and locked. When he pointed to it, she went white as chalk. "That was my husband's," she whispered. "I never opened it." But Father Brown could tell she was lying. There were scratches around the lock, fresh, as though someone had tried and failed to force it open. He asked gently, "What did you hope to find?" She did not answer. Instead, she wept, her tears falling not like those of mourning, but of someone who had been caught in a deception too heavy to bear. The secret murder, Father Brown uncovered, was not merely the killing of one man, but the murder of truth itself. Every step closer to the heart of the mystery only revealed further layers of darkness. The body under the yew was only the beginning. The erased name, the broken rosary, the burned words, the whispered confession to a corpse, each piece twisted the puzzle into something too vast and too terrible to grasp. And then came the final, unbearable twist. In the dead man's jacket, overlooked until then, Father Brown found a scrap of cloth, black, scorched, smelling faintly of incense, the same fragment he had found before in another case. But this time, it was worse. This one bore the embroidered cross of the church itself. Whoever killed the man had not only taken a life, but had done so under the shadow of the altar. Someone clothed in faith, sworn to God, had committed the murder and hidden it where they prayed. Father Brown's face grew grave as he folded the cloth and placed it in his pocket. He knew the truth, now, or enough of it to understand. But he also knew the cost. To speak it aloud would destroy not only one soul, but many. The village would fracture, faith would collapse, and those who had lied to protect the guilty would be condemned alongside him. The priest's whisper echoed through the chapel as thunder rolled outside. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The candlelight flickered against the stained glass, and for a moment it seemed as though the eyes of the saints themselves turned away, unable to watch. The murder was a secret, but a secret that poisoned the air, a secret that would never rest. And Father Brown, standing alone in the silence, carried it like a stone in his heart, knowing that some deceptions were deadlier than any blade, and that this one might yet claim him too. Chapter 3. Father Brown hunts the hidden killer. The killer was already in the crowd when the body was discovered, watching, waiting, perhaps even smiling, while every other face twisted in shock and horror. Father Brown knew it instantly. He felt it like a cold wind that passed invisibly between the villagers. Somewhere among the mourners stood the murderer, not disguised by shadows, but hidden in plain sight, masked by grief that was either feigned or too carefully measured. And the most chilling truth of all was this: the killer wanted to be found, but only if it broke the mind of the one who uncovered them. The morning began like any other, yet ended with a scream that tore the air open. A farmhand stumbled upon a lifeless figure near the chapel gates, the throat cut so cleanly that it seemed almost surgical. At first glance, it appeared to be another tragedy in a village already haunted by secrets. But the moment Father Brown bent down, his stubby fingers brushing the cold skin of the corpse, he saw the truth no one else dared notice. This death was not the work of desperation. It was a challenge, a message carved in flesh, and the priest himself was its intended reader. The inspector tried to calm the villagers, insisting the murder was the work of a vagrant passing through. But Father Brown's small, thoughtful eyes darted over the crowd. He saw the widow, pale and silent, clutching her rosary so tightly the beads cut into her flesh. He saw the blacksmith, sweat glistening on his brow, though the air was cold. He saw the schoolteacher, trembling with a fear she could not explain. Each face carried guilt or terror, or both. It was not a stranger. It was one of them. The hidden killer had woven themselves into the very fabric of the community, and now the thread of murder pulled tighter around them all. The mystery was impossible on its surface. No one claimed to have heard a struggle. No one saw a shadow cross the lane. And yet the victim's death had been timed perfectly. At the very hour when the church bell rang for evening prayer, drowning out any sound of violence. Too perfect, too calculated. Father Brown frowned, for he understood the cruel mind behind this crime was not merely trying to escape justice, but to mock it. Night fell heavy upon the village, and with it came whispers. Some said the killer was a ghost, returned to avenge the buried man under the yew tree. Others claimed the dead themselves were rising, striking down the guilty. But Father Brown, walking slowly through the mist, knew better. The devil's greatest trick was not terror from the grave, but lies whispered by the living, and lies were thick in the air. In the days that followed, the priest hunted quietly, moving from cottage to cottage, speaking softly, listening always. He noticed the details others dismissed: the widow's sudden refusal to enter the church, the sacristan's absence during the murder hour, the blacksmith's hammering late into the night, as though trying to drown out thoughts too loud for sleep. Each secret was a stone, and together they built a wall, hiding the truth. Father Brown pressed against that wall with patience, but also with dread. He feared not only what he would find, but what it would cost to reveal it. Then came the first terrifying discovery. In the vestry, hidden beneath loose boards, he found a knife. Not an ordinary blade, but one cleaned too thoroughly, gleaming in the candlelight. On its handle was carved a single word: mercy. Father Brown's heart tightened. This was no murder weapon born of anger. This was ritual again, purposeful, cold. Whoever had left it had not been careless. They had wanted it found. A taunt, a whisper in steel: "Find me if you dare." The murder that followed only deepened the nightmare. Another villager, this time the schoolteacher, was found lifeless in her bed, her face frozen in a scream. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows. The door had been locked from the inside. Impossible. Yet Father Brown knew the killer had walked in freely, as a trusted presence, someone she had allowed into her room without fear, which meant the murderer was not only hidden among them, it was someone they trusted most. The first big reveal came with a letter, slipped under Father Brown's door in the dead of night. The paper was stained with something dark, the handwriting jagged as though written in haste or terror. It read, "The killer prays beside you every Sunday. Beware the one who kneels." Father Brown read the words again and again. His blood chilled. To kneel beside him in prayer meant one thing only. The murderer was not merely among the villagers. They were among the faithful. One of the very souls who claimed to worship God was hiding the darkest crime of all. The village, already trembling, now descended into paranoia. Every parishioner eyed the one beside them in the pews. Whispers turned into accusations. Neighbors refused to speak. Husbands suspected wives. Friends suspected each other. And Father Brown, standing in the pulpit, could feel the weight of their collective fear pressing against his chest. This was the killer's true weapon, not the blade, but the corrosion of trust. Murder was their message, but suspicion was their masterpiece. One stormy night, Father Brown followed a hunch. He walked into the graveyard, his umbrella clutched tight against the howling wind. At the base of the yew tree, the same cursed tree where the first body had been found, he discovered something terrible. Fresh earth had been disturbed. Digging with his hands, he unearthed a box, small and iron-bound. Inside lay scraps of burned parchment, rosary beads snapped in two, and a strip of black cloth bearing the embroidered cross of the church. He held it in his hands, his face grave. It was the same symbol he had seen before. The killer was not outside the sanctuary. They were cloaked in it. The storm raged, lightning splitting the sky, when suddenly Father Brown heard it. Footsteps behind him. He turned, but saw only shadows moving between the gravestones. A voice whispered in the darkness, low and mocking. "You are closer than you think." And then it was gone. The priest stood alone, his heart pounding. The killer was not only hunting in the dark, they were watching him. As the investigation deepened, the villagers began to unravel. The widow confessed she had lied about the night her husband vanished, but claimed she had done so out of fear, not guilt. The blacksmith admitted he had known the first victim was in danger, but swore he had not wielded the blade. Each confession revealed more darkness, yet none gave the answer. Father Brown grew weary, not of the mystery, but of the weight it pressed upon their souls. For every clue revealed only more deceit, and each deception was deadlier than the last. And then came the final, devastating twist. In the confessional one evening, a voice spoke to Father Brown. Soft, trembling, but laced with a terror too great to hide. The penitent did not name themselves, but their words were unforgettable. "I did it. I killed them. But I am not the only one. There is another, and they will kill again." Before Father Brown could speak, the confessional door creaked open, and the figure slipped away, vanishing into the shadows. He was left in silence, the echo of the words burning in his mind. Not one killer, two. A pair of hands weaving death together, hidden among the faithful, disguised in piety. The villagers did not know this. To reveal it would break them completely. And so Father Brown walked back into the chapel, his face heavy with sorrow, his umbrella dripping with rain. He stood before the altar, staring at the crucifix, and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The candles flickered, the storm howled outside, and in the silence of the chapel, the shadows seemed to close in around him. The hidden killer was still out there, perhaps watching, perhaps kneeling beside him, perhaps even smiling. And the little priest, burdened with the truth, bore it alone, because some revelations he knew were more deadly than any murder. Chapter 4. The Terrifying Truth. Father Brown finds. The coffin was empty. When the gravediggers lowered the ropes and the lid cracked open under the weight of damp earth, they expected to see the pale face of the man they buried only a week ago. Instead, the coffin yawned wide like a mouth, hollow and bare, with nothing inside but a single folded letter pinned to the lining. "You are digging in the wrong grave." The scream that rose from the villagers was the kind that shreds the soul. But Father Brown did not flinch. He stared into the abyss of the coffin, his round face set, his eyes unreadable behind his glasses, and he whispered to himself, "The body was never meant to rest here. The truth is still walking among us." The problem was not only impossible, it was monstrous. The man had been buried. Dozens had attended the funeral. The soil had been sealed. The prayers had been spoken. And yet now, in front of them all, there was nothing. The inspector shouted orders, demanded answers, but every voice in the crowd stammered or fell silent. The widow fainted. The sacristan swore by the saints that he had seen the body placed in the coffin himself, and yet here was proof, colder than stone, that what they had witnessed was not what they believed. Father Brown felt the air thicken with fear, a fear so suffocating that even the birds fell silent in the trees. That night, when the villagers huddled in their homes and bolted their doors, Father Brown sat alone in the chapel. He asked no questions aloud, but his thoughts were relentless. Who had taken the body? Why leave the coffin empty? And what message did the cryptic letter conceal? He turned the paper over in his hands again and again. The words "wrong grave" echoed in his mind, but their meaning was not clear. Did it mean the body was buried elsewhere, or that the real grave was not of earth, but of conscience? The investigation deepened, and with it came a darkness more suffocating than before. Father Brown visited the widow, who was pale and trembling in her parlor. Her eyes darted to the window every time the wind rattled the shutters, as though she expected someone or something to appear outside. She swore she had not seen her husband's body since the day of the funeral. Yet Father Brown noticed something on the mantel, a candle stub, half melted, with wax the color of blood. It had burned recently, too recently. He asked her gently who had lit it. She froze, her lips parting as though she might confess, but then she shook her head violently and whispered, "It wasn't me." The sacristan was next. The man who had sworn he saw the corpse lowered into the coffin now changed his story. He admitted he had only glimpsed the shrouded figure from a distance, and that he had never touched the body himself. "It could have been anyone under the sheet," he muttered, refusing to meet the priest's gaze. Father Brown pressed him quietly. "And who wanted you to think it was the man?" The sacristan's face turned ashen, but he gave no answer. In the church records, Father Brown uncovered something worse. A death certificate had been signed by the doctor, yet the signature was shaky, blurred, as though written by someone forced to write against their will. The ink had smeared across the page, and in the corner of the paper, pressed faintly into the parchment, was the outline of a fingerprint, a mark of someone who should never have touched it. Father Brown held it under the candlelight, his heart sinking with the realization. The very proof of death had been forged. The first great reveal came suddenly, like a blade in the dark. A child confessed to Father Brown in whispers that she had seen the dead man walking in the woods 3 nights after his funeral. She had recognized him by his coat, by the way he limped on his left leg, but his face, she said, was pale, twisted, as though he was not alive, not fully. When Father Brown asked what he was doing, her little voice trembled. He was digging. The priest's face turned grave. If true, the dead man had not been dead at all, or worse. Someone had wanted them to believe he was buried while he moved in secret through the night. But digging what? A grave for himself? Or a grave for another? The more Father Brown uncovered, the more the truth twisted into terror. The villagers were no longer merely frightened. They were unraveling. Doors slammed shut when he passed. Windows shuttered against his knock. In hushed voices, people whispered of curses, of bodies that would not stay buried, of sins too great to confess. A shadow seemed to pass through the village, not human, not visible, but heavy enough to crush the soul. One night, while pacing the chapel, Father Brown heard something scrape beneath the altar. Dropping to his knees, he pushed aside the cloth and found a trapdoor half buried in dust. It was old, so old that no one had spoken of it for decades. When he lifted it, the air that rushed out was damp, foul, and heavy with decay. He lit a lantern and descended. Beneath the chapel lay a crypt, and there, among the stone coffins, he found a horror beyond words. Bones had been disturbed, skulls cracked open, coffins smashed, and in the corner, freshly dug, was a shallow pit, half filled with dirt. Beside it lay the body of the man who was supposed to be in the graveyard. His face was ghastly pale, his eyes open in eternal terror, his lips torn as if by some final scream. Father Brown's lantern shook in his hand. The coffin had been empty because the body had been hidden here. But why? And by whom? Pinned to the corpse's chest was another letter. This one bore only 4 words, scrawled in a trembling hand. He was not alone. Father Brown staggered back, the pit yawning at his feet. Not alone. Did it mean he had an accomplice? Did it mean he had been murdered by more than one hand? Or did it mean something even darker, that death itself was shared, multiplied, woven through the village like a disease? The priest's thoughts reeled. Nothing fit, and yet everything pointed to a truth so terrifying that to speak it would tear the village apart. And then came the final, unbearable twist. As Father Brown turned to leave the crypt, his lantern cast a long shadow across the stone wall. There, carved deep into the stone centuries ago, were words he had never seen before. The guilty pray, louder than the innocent. His blood ran cold. It was not just a murder. It was a ritual of concealment, a deception, so vast it had been carved into the very stones of the church. The killer was not only among them, but they had been hiding in the open, cloaked in prayer, disguising their guilt as devotion. Father Brown closed his eyes, clutching his umbrella in the dark. He knew now. He had pieced enough together to see the face of the killer. But he also knew the cost of revealing it. It would shatter faith, destroy lives, and unleash a scandal too black for the village to survive. He stood in the shadows of the crypt and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The lantern flickered, the crypt sighed with silence, and above, the chapel bell tolled midnight. The villagers slept uneasily, unaware that their faith itself was poisoned, that their sanctuary hid a murderer who walked among them still. And Father Brown, burdened with the terrifying truth, bore it in silence, knowing that some truths, once spoken, could kill more surely than any blade. Chapter 5. Father Brown exposes a sinister plot. They buried the wrong man, and Father Brown knew it the very moment the coffin lid was shut. It was not grief that filled the chapel that day, nor the whispers of sorrow, but something colder, sharper, an unease that crept like smoke between the pews, poisoning every prayer and every glance. The face in the coffin had been still, waxen, drained of life, Yet the silence that followed the burial was not mourning, but fear. And Father Brown, standing, apart with his round spectacles glinting under the dim light, understood something no one else dared to admit. The man in the grave was not meant to die, and the real death had yet to be revealed. From that instant, the air grew heavy with secrets. Every word spoken by the villagers seemed rehearsed, every handshake a disguise, every smile a mask concealing something rotten beneath. A simple funeral had turned into a stage performance where no one dared stumble over their lines, but Brown's sharp eyes noticed the hesitation in voices, the falter in footsteps, the odd details that should not have belonged. He had seen it before. Sin dressed up as sorrow, guilt parading as grief, and it always ended the same way, in revelation, in ruin. The coffin had barely touched the earth when Father Brown's suspicions bloomed. The man lowered into the ground had been declared dead of natural causes, yet his death was anything but natural. No one wished to ask questions, but Brown's conscience would not allow silence. He noticed a pattern already forming in the village, like threads of a web, and someone sat at its center, pulling every strand. The whispers began with one strange observation. The widow had not shed a single tear. Her lips quivered. Her hands clutched a handkerchief, but her eyes stayed dry. Some said it was shock, others called it strength, but Father Brown saw in her face something colder. Relief. Relief so carefully hidden it almost passed as dignity. Almost. But she was not alone in her odd performance. The village doctor, pale and sweating during the service, fumbled with his prayer book, as though fearing the weight of his own conscience. A local businessman, seated at the back, never looked at the coffin once, but kept darting his gaze toward the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any second. And the parish verger, usually devout, muttered his responses to the liturgy without conviction, as though afraid that speaking too loudly would summon something unwanted. It was not one man who was dead, Father Brown realized. It was truth itself, smothered and buried beneath the pretense of respectability. Later that evening, as he walked through the fog that swallowed the churchyard, he could almost hear the village breathing uneasily, like a beast that had swallowed poison and waited for it to act. It was not just a death. It was the beginning of something larger, something calculated. The man in the grave was a sacrifice, not a victim, and the ritual had only just begun. The first clue came not from the living, but from the dead. Brown, granted a discreet moment before the coffin was sealed, had noticed something others had ignored: faint bruising beneath the jawline, a mark that did not belong to sleep or age. A man who had supposedly died in his sleep had in truth been silenced. But why? Why here? Why now? And why him? The deeper Father Brown looked, the more the village resisted. Questions were met with silence, doors closed, before he could knock, and the faces that greeted him in daylight turned into shadows once dusk fell. Yet it was in those shadows that Brown found the first fragments of truth. A ledger half burned in the fireplace of the inn, numbers that did not add up, a bloodstain, faint but undeniable, on a discarded glove in the rectory garden. And the widow, who received secret letters written in a hand that was not her husband's, all threads leading not to an accident of fate, but to a design so sinister that it made Father Brown pause at every turn. This was not a crime of passion, nor even of greed. It was a plot so intricate that the death was only one small part of it. The doctor was not guilty of negligence, but of knowledge. He had signed a false certificate because the truth would have undone him. The businessman's restless eyes hid debts so vast they threatened to collapse the village itself, and the widow's relief was not born of freedom from her husband, but from the promise of something darker, a pact struck in secret, a gain that demanded a price. Yet even as Father Brown pieced together fragments, the truth grew more tangled, not less. Every revelation opened another wound. Every clue only deepened the labyrinth. If the village had been a stage before, now it was a trap, designed to confuse, to mislead, to turn suspicion into madness. The first big reveal came one night when Father Brown stood alone in the church, candlelight trembling on the stone walls. He found an envelope pushed beneath the door, addressed not to him, but to the one who knows. Inside, a single sentence, written in a sharp hand. The man they buried was never meant to die. The words chilled him because he had already known it in his heart, but someone else knew that he knew. The plot was no longer hidden in the dark corners of the village. It was watching him, breathing down his neck, daring him to speak, daring him to step too close to the truth. And Brown understood then that he was not merely uncovering a crime. He was walking into a design, a sinister game where the players were willing to kill again to keep their secrets intact. From that moment, the village seemed alive with menace. Every creak of a door, every whisper in the inn, every echo in the churchyard felt like a warning. And yet Father Brown pressed forward, his round little figure moving with steady persistence, because he knew the truth was there, terrifying, tangled, and closer than anyone dared admit. The cliffhanger came not in the form of another body, but in the revelation of a name. For in one of the widow's secret letters, hastily burned, yet not completely destroyed, a single word remained legible: brotherhood. A word that did not belong in simple village life, but in something far larger, far darker. Father Brown's breath caught as he pieced the fragments together. This was not one crime. It was a network, a brotherhood hidden in plain sight, weaving its threads through business, faith, medicine, and family. And the death was not the end, but the beginning of their work. Standing in the cold silence of the church, he whispered to himself, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And with those words, the darkness deepened, for the plot was no longer about one man's death, but about the village itself, a place where everyone was both victim and conspirator, prisoner and jailer, innocent and guilty at once. Chapter 6. The mystery Father Brown couldn't ignore. The scream came not from the mouth of a living person, but from a coffin buried 6 feet under the earth, and Father Brown swore he heard it. It was not merely imagination, not the eerie trick of the wind sliding through the yew trees of the churchyard, but a cry of such human anguish that it seemed to claw its way into the priest's very soul. In that instant, the world shifted from the familiar into the grotesque, and the case before him was no longer a matter of rumor or suspicion, but something darker, something that demanded to be solved, even if it tore open the very fabric of reason itself. It had begun quietly, with whispers carried through the village like smoke from a smoldering fire. A death had occurred, but not the sort of death one could leave respectfully buried in the parish register. The woman, young, lovely, but marked with a shadow in her reputation, had been found lifeless in her own parlor. The coroner had spoken of illness, a sudden collapse, nothing that would trouble the balance of nature. Yet her neighbors had not spoken of illness. They had spoken of eyes that seemed too wide open, of lips twisted in what looked like a last, unspeakable terror. And when Father Brown stood before her grave, he could not dismiss the feeling that the earth beneath him was not still, but restless. The mystery began to coil itself around him with the quiet persistence of ivy, gripping tighter each day. He could not ignore the inconsistencies, the absence of medicine bottles, though the woman was known to be unwell, the peculiar silence of her fiancé who had vanished the night of her death, and the letter, half-burnt, that Father Brown found discarded in the fireplace as if someone had desperately wanted its message swallowed by ash. Yet even fragments could tell a story. "I cannot live with what I have seen," the letter began, and then abruptly, nothing but char and smoke. He walked through the village with his cassock brushing the dust of the narrow lanes, listening more than he spoke. It was not evidence that he sought, but human hearts, yet each heart he approached seemed to throb with guilt. A maid who trembled too much when asked about her mistress, a shopkeeper who refused to speak of the fiancé, a child who claimed she had seen someone standing outside the window of the dead woman's parlor the very night she died. These were not explanations. They were fragments of a nightmare that only deepened. The darkness, the suspense grew unbearable when Father Brown entered the woman's home at dusk, armed only with his small umbrella and his unfailing belief in truth. The room smelled faintly of lavender, yet beneath it lingered something foul, an odor of iron and fear. He noticed the overturned chair. The clock stopped at exactly 11:43, and on the windowsill a smear so faint it could have been overlooked. The trace of blood wiped hastily by a hand that feared discovery. The shadows in the room seemed alive, as though each corner concealed a secret waiting to leap forward. And for the first time, Father Brown felt a chill that went beyond the cold of evening. It was the chill of being watched, but it was the first reveal that nearly unmoored him. The doctor who had signed the death certificate had left out a detail so shocking that when Father Brown confronted him in quiet conversation, the man turned pale. There had been marks, tiny, almost invisible bruises around the woman's neck, as if someone had pressed not with fingers, but with a cord, gentle enough not to break the skin, cruel enough to steal her breath away. The doctor had dismissed them, fearful of scandal, fearful of the power that lay hidden in the village's most respected family, the family to which the vanished fiancé belonged. Suddenly, everything was different. What seemed a natural death now carried the foul scent of murder, and worse. It was a murder wrapped in conspiracy, silence, and power. The fiancé's absence was no mere grief-stricken flight, but perhaps an erasure, a vanishing act that others had carefully arranged. Father Brown saw the shape of something vast, a plot that ran deeper than a single crime. And he realized with horror that every person he had spoken to, every villager who turned their eyes away, was not merely ignorant, but complicit in a lie too great to speak aloud. The deeper he dug, the darker it grew. He discovered another letter, hidden inside the lining of a hymn book, one that had been meant for the dead woman's friend, but never delivered. It contained a single line that shattered certainty like glass. "If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident. It will be his doing." No name was given, but Father Brown understood at once the deliberate cruelty of the omission. The woman had been afraid, so afraid she dared not name her tormentor, because to write his name was to give him power, even in death. The priest's heart sank as he pieced together the threads, yet every thread twisted into a knot rather than untying. Was it the fiancé, desperate to conceal a secret? Was it the family, guarding their honor at the expense of truth? Or was it something more insidious, a collective silence so thick that even Father Brown's gentle persistence might not break it? Each possibility was monstrous, each more believable than the last. And then came the moment that froze the blood in his veins. A villager, trembling, confessed that the night after the burial, he had passed by the churchyard and seen the earth at the young woman's grave disturb itself, as if something beneath was moving. He swore he heard a faint choking sob carried on the night air. Madness, imagination, or a truth too ghastly to contemplate, that the woman had not been dead when lowered into her coffin. Father Brown felt the scream again, echoing in his mind, and he wondered if the true crime was not murder, but something even worse, indifference to a life still struggling for breath. The story had become too much for one man to hold. The viewer, too, can feel it now. This crushing sense of a mystery too complex, too horrifying to bear. Each answer only births another question. Each discovery unearths something more sinister, until the entire village feels like a stage upon which everyone wears a mask. Father Brown's calm voice falters only once when he whispers, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." For to tell it would destroy not just a single man or family, but the fragile fabric of trust that held the village together. And so we are left at the cliff's edge, staring into the abyss of unanswered questions. Was the fiancé the killer, or merely another victim of a larger design? Was the woman truly dead when buried, or had the ground itself swallowed a living soul while her neighbors watched in silence? And above all, why does Father Brown, who always speaks the truth, choose this time to let the secret rot unspoken in the dark? The mystery Father Brown couldn't ignore is now the mystery the viewer cannot escape. It is not solved, not explained, but alive, breathing in the silence between every word, whispering through the yew trees, echoing in the coffin's scream that refuses to be forgotten. Chapter 7. Father Brown reveals dark village secrets. They buried the wrong body in the village graveyard, and Father Brown was the only one who noticed. The words hung like a curse, a revelation so unthinkable it twisted the quiet heart of the village into a chamber of horrors. What had seemed like an ordinary funeral, somber faces, bowed heads, murmured prayers, was suddenly transformed into the stage of a sinister performance, one that Father Brown realized was stitched together with lies, silence, and the darkest secrets the villagers thought would never surface. From that single, dreadful moment, nothing could be trusted. Not the faces of neighbors, not the cries of grief, not even the ground itself, where the dead had been laid. The mystery began as softly as smoke curling from a candle, fragile and barely visible, but beneath its wisps was a choking fire, waiting to devour. Father Brown, with his quiet manner and unassuming presence, had walked past the rows of headstones countless times, whispering his prayers. Yet on this particular evening, something unsettled him. It was not the weather, though the sky carried the bruised color of an oncoming storm. Nor was it the murmurs of gossip among the mourners who whispered their suspicions in the shadows. No, it was the coffin, the way it sat too low in the earth, as if someone had forced it there hurriedly, without reverence. A small detail, a minor imperfection, but one that pierced him with dreadful certainty. When he leaned close, he saw it. The initials on the casket plate did not match the name on the gravestone. It was an error no one else had noticed. Or if they had, they dared not speak. The wrong body had been buried, and the right one. Where was it? Already the mystery expanded like a spider's web, each silken thread leading deeper into shadow. Who had been hidden in that grave, and why? And more terrifyingly, who had gone missing in silence, erased as if their life no longer mattered? The deeper Father Brown pressed, the darker the truth became. The village was not what it seemed. The cobblestone streets, the laughter in the tavern, the cheery greetings in the market, they were nothing but a mask. Behind the mask, fear was festering. People avoided his eyes, doors shut quickly as he passed, and whispers fell silent when his cassock brushed the air. It was as though the entire village had signed a silent pact to keep something buried, not only in the earth, but in their souls. Every step Father Brown took felt like walking into a labyrinth, each corner twisting further from the light, leaving him lost in shadows that threatened to consume even his faith. He found himself recalling odd fragments of past conversations, moments that once seemed harmless, but now revealed sinister undertones. The widow who wept too theatrically at her husband's grave. The butcher who had suddenly closed shop with no explanation. The child who asked him, in a trembling voice, if the bad man would stay asleep this time. Every detail returned to him, forming a tapestry of deceit so complex it felt designed to break the very mind that tried to unravel it. Father Brown prayed for clarity, but with every revelation, confusion only deepened. The village was hiding more than a mistake. It was hiding rot. The first shocking clue emerged when Father Brown ventured into the vestry late one night, led there by an instinct he could not explain. In the candlelight, tucked inside the parish register, was a torn page, a record of a funeral that had never officially taken place. The name had been scratched out so violently the ink bled through the paper, but the date was still visible. The missing funeral aligned perfectly with the burial he had witnessed. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase the identity of the dead, to strip them of even the dignity of remembrance. And worse still, the handwriting on the record was not unfamiliar. His heart beat like a drum in the silence. If his suspicion was right, the hand that had falsified the record belonged to someone he trusted, someone whose face he had seen at Mass, bowed in prayer. The weight of betrayal pressed on him, leaving him shaken, almost nauseous, but he could not stop. If he stopped now, the truth would remain buried forever, and the evil would spread unchecked. It was then that the first big reveal shattered what little stability remained. In the hidden pocket of a confessional booth, Father Brown found a letter, sealed in wax. The handwriting was hurried, desperate, and the words inside spoke of a pact made in blood, a pact to protect a secret so vile that revealing it would destroy the village from within. The letter spoke of guilt, of sin so great it could not be named outright, only hinted at with trembling phrases. What we did that night, the silence we swore to keep. The price of betrayal is death. The letter bore no signature, but the implications were clear. Several people in the village were bound together by a dark act they had committed in unison. The coffin, the erased name, the false grief, it was all part of a larger, sinister plot. Father Brown realized with horror that he was not dealing with a single crime, but with an entire network of complicity. And then came the most disturbing question of all. Was the wrong body buried by mistake, or was it a warning? The weight of suspicion turned every villager into a suspect. The kindly innkeeper, who always saved him a seat by the fire, might have blood on his hands. The schoolmistress who smiled so sweetly at the children might have been the one who wrote the desperate letter. Even the doctor, whose calm hands healed wounds, might have inflicted a wound too deep to be forgiven. The village itself seemed to conspire against him, each familiar face now wearing the ghost of guilt. But what chilled him most was the silence. No one confronted him, no one tried to stop him, and yet he felt watched at every step. It was as though the villagers knew what he was discovering and were silently daring him to continue, to walk willingly into the noose of knowledge they had hung for him. The truth was there, waiting, but it was a truth that could shatter more than his own peace. It could unravel the entire fabric of the place he had sworn to protect. The final moments of the chapter left the air heavy with dread. Father Brown, standing alone in the graveyard at midnight, whispered a prayer over the wrong grave. He pressed his hand to the cold stone, and in the stillness he said softly, "I know what you're hiding, but God help me, I don't know if I can bear to speak it." His voice trembled, not from fear of death, but from fear of truth. Lightning tore the sky, thunder rolled over the village, and as the rain began to fall, he realized something that made his soul quake. The body buried in that grave was not a stranger at all. It was someone the villagers had known intimately, someone whose disappearance had been explained away with lies so carefully woven that no one dared tug at the threads. But Father Brown had tugged, and now the entire tapestry was threatening to collapse. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with suffocating suspense. Father Brown turns from the grave, his face pale, his heart pounding, and whispers to himself words that the audience will never forget. "I know who you are, and I know why they buried you, but the truth will not be told tonight. Would you like me to expand this into the full 3,500-word script right now, weaving in more layers of psychological tension, false leads, and deeper village secrets to amplify the suspense?" Chapter 8. The Killer. Hiding from Father Brown. The night the body was found, Father Brown whispered something so chilling that even the police inspector refused to write it down. "The killer has never left this room." With those words, the village seemed to shatter into silence, as though every shadow held a secret, and every eye might be watching. It had started innocently enough, or at least as innocently as death ever begins. A villager, known for his quiet habits and unremarkable life, was discovered lying cold on the chapel steps. There were no wounds, no blood, no sign of struggle, and yet his eyes were wide, staring into nothingness with such terror that people swore he had seen something from beyond this world. The inspector concluded it was a sudden seizure, a natural death. But Father Brown, standing at the edge of the crowd, knew differently. He could smell the presence of evil the way a hound scents a wolf. The villagers tried to return to their lives, but unease settled over the streets like a fog. Doors were bolted earlier, candles burned later into the night, and yet no one could shake the feeling that danger had not passed, but lingered close, like something crouching in the dark, waiting. Father Brown could not ignore it. Something in the man's fixed stare, in the way his hands were clenched, suggested his last moments were anything but ordinary. He had seen someone he feared so profoundly that death had claimed him before he could cry out. Father Brown wandered the lanes of the village, his cassock brushing against the stone walls. He noticed odd details that unsettled him further. A shoe print, too deep in the mud, as though someone had been standing still for hours in one place. A half-burned candle, hidden in the hedge behind the inn, its wax fresh enough to suggest a watcher in the night, and a child who spoke of a man with no face standing at her window, though no one believed her. Every detail pointed to something calculated, patient, and terrifyingly close. But the more he pieced together, the more the pattern resisted him. Every theory he formed seemed to crumble. The villagers had alibis that overlapped like a perfectly rehearsed play, each one speaking for the other. Their words sounded convincing, but there was something hollow in their tone, like actors reciting lines they had practiced too long. Father Brown felt the walls of the mystery closing around him, suffocating in its perfection. And yet, he was certain there was no perfection in evil. Somewhere, someone had slipped. It was during a late-night walk near the chapel that he uncovered the first fragment of truth. A sound, a faint cough, escaped from the shadows where no one should have been. When Father Brown turned, the figure was gone, melting into the night. But on the stone wall, he found the faintest smear of ash. Not candle ash, not wood, cigarette ash. The dead man had been a lifelong non-smoker, and few in the village indulged. Fewer still carried the imported brand. This ash revealed someone had been standing where the body fell, waiting, watching, unseen by all. This discovery did not clarify the mystery. It darkened it. The inspector dismissed it as irrelevant. The villagers whispered theories of demons, curses, or wandering madmen. Father Brown said nothing, but he carried the ash like a weight in his pocket, as though the tiny grey smear held the key to a door no one dared open. Then came the first real shock. As he visited the widow of the deceased, he noticed something strange. A photograph missing from the mantel. The outline of dust on the wood showed where it had stood for years. But when Father Brown gently asked, the widow denied it had ever been there. Her eyes flickered, just for an instant, toward the dresser drawer she kept locked. He said nothing more, but in that glance he saw the shadow of the truth. There was a memory being buried, a face being hidden, and the widow was terrified of revealing it. That night, Father Brown could not sleep. His small room in the presbytery felt suffocating, as though unseen eyes pressed against the window pane. He prayed, but even his prayers felt weighted with dread. When the candle finally guttered out, he whispered aloud into the darkness, "You are here, aren't you?" And the silence that followed seemed almost to answer him. By morning, his resolve had hardened. He began to speak to villagers quietly, carefully, drawing out confessions, wrapped in half-truths. One admitted hearing footsteps outside her door, but never dared open it. Another said he had seen the deceased speaking to someone near the churchyard days before his death, but could not remember the face, could not, or would not. Each fragment hinted at a presence, someone moving among them, unseen, yet always there. The first big reveal came in the most chilling way. While examining the chapel at dusk, Father Brown noticed a carved message scratched faintly into the wooden pew, so faint it might have been missed forever. The words read, "He knows." Nothing more, no signature, no explanation. Just those two words, etched by a trembling hand. The dead man had left them there, a desperate warning. He had seen something, someone, and that knowledge had killed him. At that moment, Father Brown felt his heart sink. The killer was not an outsider, not a stranger who had wandered in and vanished again. The killer was inside the village, hidden in plain sight, waiting for Father Brown to make a wrong move. And worse still, the murderer already knew Father Brown was hunting him. Every word the villagers spoke began to twist in his ears. Who could he trust? The widow, hiding her photograph? The innkeeper, whose accounts of the night kept changing in small, subtle ways? Or the inspector himself, too quick to dismiss every clue as imagination? Father Brown felt himself circling in a labyrinth, with walls that shifted each time he thought he was close to the exit. The weight of the secret pressed harder with each passing hour. He saw it in their eyes now, fear disguised as courtesy, guilt hidden beneath small talk. He began to wonder, not if he would uncover the killer, but whether he would survive the truth once it was revealed. For this was no ordinary crime of passion or greed. It was something more, something planned, rehearsed, carried out with precision and cruelty. The killer was not only hiding from Father Brown, the killer was taunting him, daring him to look too closely. And then came the moment that shattered even Father Brown's calm resolve. Alone in the church at midnight, he felt a breath at the back of his neck. He turned sharply, but the pews were empty, the doors locked. Yet on the altar lay a single object that had not been there before, the missing photograph from the widow's mantle. And the face in that photograph, half burned, charred at the edges, was not the deceased. It was someone still alive, someone Father Brown had spoken to that very morning. The realization struck like thunder. The dead man had died because he had seen this face. The widow had hidden it in terror. And now the killer had placed it on the altar, as if to whisper, "I am always one step ahead of you." Father Brown stared at the photograph until the candlelight flickered across the eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt the true weight of helplessness. He could name the face, he could walk to their door, but he knew, if he spoke too soon, if he revealed too much, the killer would strike again, and the next victim might not be a man on the chapel steps, it might be him. The villagers slept uneasily, unaware that death moved silently among them. And Father Brown, clutching the charred photograph, whispered only to himself, "I know who did it, but God help me. The truth will never be told." Chapter 9. Father Brown confronts a shocking betrayal. The first sound was not a scream, nor a cry for help, but the calm, deliberate voice of Father Brown whispering in the dark, "The person I trusted most has betrayed me." With those words, the entire village, the entire investigation, and perhaps even the very foundations of morality were torn to pieces. Because if the one man who lived by truth could say such a thing, if he could accuse not just a stranger, but someone within his closest circle, then nothing was safe anymore. And the worst part? Father Brown did not say it with anger or even sorrow. He said it as though he had known all along, as if betrayal were not an act, but a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. The night had already felt heavy, but when that confession slipped from his lips, the air itself turned suffocating. The village had long been hiding its secrets, murder whispered behind curtains, greed tucked inside church pews, sins dressed as kindness. But this was different. This wasn't just another crime. This was the unraveling of trust itself. Who could betray Father Brown? Who could deceive the one man whose eyes seemed to pierce through lies as though they were glass? The question struck harder than any accusation of murder. If Father Brown had been betrayed, then every friendship in the village was suddenly suspect. Every handshake became a trap. Every smile hid venom. The mystery began long before his chilling whisper. It began with a disappearance, not of a body, but of something stranger, an object too small to matter to most, yet far too symbolic to ignore. It was a key, a simple iron key that unlocked a cupboard in the church vestry. At first, no one thought much of it. Keys go missing. They're dropped in pockets, misplaced on tables, stolen by children at play. But Father Brown knew better. He always did. That key had vanished the very night a man was found dead at the edge of the village pond. The timing was no coincidence, but what chilled Father Brown was not the murder itself. It was the fact that whoever had taken the key had done so not for theft, not for greed, but for silence. The cupboard had held papers, confessions, personal letters, words entrusted to the church with the expectation that they would remain unseen. And now, those words were gone. The investigation twisted quickly. Father Brown followed trails no one else would have noticed. Mud on a carpet, ink stains on a sleeve, the faint scent of tobacco where none should have been. Every clue pointed not to strangers, not to outsiders, but to those within his very circle. People he ate with, people who prayed beside him, people who looked him in the eye and said they trusted him. And yet, as he drew closer, the picture blurred. Each discovery only deepened the shadows. Was this about blackmail? Was someone using the stolen confessions to manipulate others? Or was it something darker still, an attempt to frame Father Brown himself, to drag his name into the mud of suspicion? When he uncovered the first shocking detail, the mystery collapsed into chaos. Among the missing papers was a letter, one he himself had written. A letter that should never have been seen, not by anyone. In it, Father Brown had confessed not a crime, but a truth so dangerous it could destroy the village forever. The truth that he already knew the identity of the man's killer, but could not reveal it. The letter named no names, but it held enough hints to make anyone with cunning piece together the impossible. That meant whoever had stolen the papers now had the power not only to expose others, but to expose him. For the first time, Father Brown's integrity itself had become a weapon in someone else's hands. From that moment, the suspense grew unbearable. He began to notice strange things, shadows that lingered too long at the edge of his vision, footsteps that stopped when he turned, familiar faces avoiding his eyes. And then came the cruelest twist of all. The voice. He heard it first, in the dead of night, when the church was empty, save for his prayers. A whisper so close it might have been in his ear. "You should not have trusted me." He turned, and no one was there. Yet the words cut him to the core, because they weren't just a threat. They were personal. The betrayer was not a stranger. They were someone who had earned his trust, someone who had stood close enough to know the rhythm of his breath, the shape of his silences. The first big reveal came suddenly, like lightning tearing across the sky. Father Brown discovered that the man found dead at the pond had not been the betrayer at all. He had been the first victim. The true betrayer had used the chaos of that death to cover their own crime. They had planted doubts, shifted suspicions, and stolen the key in the midst of confusion. The murder, it seemed, had been nothing more than the opening act. The real performance was still unfolding, and Father Brown realized he was standing not as the detective, but as the target. What followed was a descent into a labyrinth of fear and doubt. He could no longer trust the laughter of the villagers, the hospitality of their tables, even the words of those who swore loyalty to him. Each confession he heard in the church seemed laced with hidden meaning, as though every sinner were mocking him with their half-truths. His mind, so steady, began to crack under the weight of uncertainty. Was he chasing shadows? Or was the entire village complicit in the betrayal? What if this was not the act of one, but of many? And yet through all the confusion, one detail kept gnawing at him. A ring, small, silver, easily overlooked. He had seen it once on the hand of a friend, then again in the mud near the vestry door. It was nothing extraordinary, and yet it gleamed in his memory like a dagger's edge. The ring was proof, but proof of what? Proof that the betrayer had been near the church that night? Or proof that the betrayer was closer than he could bear to imagine? The cliffhanger came with unbearable force. Father Brown gathered the villagers one evening, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. He spoke not of sin, nor of forgiveness, but of betrayal. He told them plainly that he had been deceived, that the killer was among them, and worse, that the betrayer was not the killer at all. The betrayer was someone who had deliberately helped the killer escape justice. Gasps echoed through the room. Faces turned pale, but Father Brown did not point a finger. He simply said, "I know who you are." Then he turned away, leaving the silence to crush them all. And in that silence, the weight of suspicion fell on everyone. Was it the friend who had stood by him in the darkest hours? Was it the one who claimed to admire him most? Or was it someone who had always seemed harmless, hiding behind innocence? No one could know, because Father Brown would not tell them. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The final scene left everything in unbearable tension. Alone, standing in the quiet of the vestry, Father Brown whispered again, almost to himself, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." His hand rested on the empty cupboard, where secrets had once been locked away, and his eyes closed, as though the knowledge itself was a wound too deep to heal. The betrayal had been revealed to him, but to speak it aloud would destroy more than it would save. And so the mystery remained, twisting through the air like smoke, choking the hearts of everyone who had ever trusted him. Because the cruelest betrayal of all is not when a killer hides in the dark. It is when someone you love hands you the knife and makes you doubt whether it was ever really yours to hold. Chapter 10. The Case That Frightened Father Brown. The corpse's eyes were still open, and in them, Father Brown saw something he had never seen before. Fear that did not belong to the dead, but to the living who had left it behind. The little priest stood in silence, his hat in his hands, as though even his faith faltered in the face of what lay before him. He was no stranger to murder, nor to the tangled webs of sin that led men to unspeakable deeds, but this case was different. It was not simply death. It was a warning, a message, and the longer he looked into those glassy eyes, the more he felt as if the killer were watching him, daring him to come closer, daring him to uncover a truth that would not only unravel the village, but perhaps undo his very soul. The villagers whispered in corners, the shutters of their homes drawn tight, though it was still daylight. Even the air seemed to hang heavy, as though it had absorbed the collective dread. Nobody wanted to speak of what had been found, but everybody knew. A man had been murdered, but the manner of his death was unlike anything Father Brown had ever encountered. No wounds, no poison, no sign of struggle, and yet the corpse lay twisted as though it had glimpsed something so terrible, so unnatural, that the heart had simply stopped in terror. How does one begin to investigate a crime that feels more like a curse? Father Brown began to walk the edges of the village, his eyes scanning not for clues, but for patterns of fear. He often said that people's sins write themselves across their faces in the way they avoid eye contact or clutch too tightly to prayer beads. But this was worse. This was a collective silence, a suffocating hush that told him the people were not just frightened of a murderer. They were frightened of what the murder meant. He questioned a farmer by the gate, and the man trembled so violently that he dropped his spade. He asked a widow if she had heard anything, and she slammed her door with such force that the crucifix above her mantel fell from the wall. Everywhere, doors shut, curtains twitched, and in every retreating step, Father Brown felt the shadow of something larger, as though the whole village was conspiring with silence. But the silence could not last. It cracked late that night in the tavern, where whispers turned to drunken mutters and mutters into arguments. A man's voice rose above the rest. It wasn't natural. He saw it before it killed him. That's why his face was like that. The crowd fell silent when Father Brown entered, but the words had already slipped into his mind, fastening themselves like hooks. Not natural. What had he seen? Could terror itself kill a man? Or was there something far worse, something that preyed on fear as much as flesh? Father Brown began his quiet investigation. He examined the body again, this time alone, in the candlelight of the church crypt, where it had been placed. The features were distorted not by violence, but by horror itself, the eyes staring at some vision only the dead man had seen. Brown bent low, whispering as though to the soul that might still linger. "What did you see?" But no answer came, only the sound of dripping water and the echo of his own breath. And yet in the stillness, a realization crept into his mind like an intruder. Perhaps the killer was not hiding at all. Perhaps the killer wanted him to look, to stare into the face of fear, to be drawn deeper into a labyrinth with no escape. And then it began. Small things at first. A shadow across the churchyard when no one was there. A sound of footsteps following him home through the fog. A letter slipped beneath his door, unsigned, containing only one sentence. "You cannot solve what is not meant to be solved." Father Brown's heart tightened as he read it, not from fear for himself, but from the realization that whoever he was dealing with was not merely a murderer. They were a mind that sought to control, to frighten, to dominate the will of an entire village. Murder, in this case, was not the end. It was the beginning. The deeper he pressed, the stranger the revelations became. He discovered that the victim had been asking questions about an old crime, one buried so deep in the village's memory that even the oldest parishioners refused to speak of it. A crime never solved, a crime that still cast its shadow decades later. Could this new death be linked to the past, or was the past only a convenient mask for something worse? Father Brown felt the lines blur, as though the past and present murders were stitched together by invisible threads that only the killer could see. And then came the first big reveal, an object discovered beneath the floorboards of the victim's home. Not a weapon, not a clue in the ordinary sense, but a diary. Its pages were half burned, its words smeared with water and ash. But what remained was chilling. The victim had written of a face in the crowd that is not a face at all, and of hearing his own name whispered from the shadows, though no one was there. He had written, "If I tell Father Brown what I know, I will not live to see morning." And yet he never did tell. With this discovery, the case only deepened, twisting in on itself, until Father Brown began to question not just who the killer was, but what they wanted. Was this about silencing the past, about punishing those who sought truth? Or was it a game, a psychological labyrinth built to confuse him, to frighten him, to remind him that even he could be shaken, and indeed he was shaken. For the first time in his years of solving crimes and confronting evil, he felt the cold touch of genuine fear, not for his body, but for his mind. The villagers began to avoid him. Where once they had trusted his insight, now they treated him like a man cursed. Children crossed the road to avoid passing him. Shopkeepers closed their shutters when he approached. It was as if his pursuit of the truth had made him untouchable, dangerous, and perhaps that was the killer's greatest trick, not to murder the priest, but to isolate him, to turn the village against him, to leave him alone in the dark with only the whispers of the dead for company. And still, the mystery remained unsolved. Each clue led to another question. Each answer only fractured into more confusion. Father Brown stood at the altar late one night, his hands gripping the wood, whispering a prayer. "Grant me clarity, Lord, for I am walking in shadows." And as he prayed, the church door creaked open, slow and deliberate. He turned, expecting perhaps a parishioner seeking comfort, but there was no one there, only the cold night wind and the faint sound of laughter drifting on it, laughter that made the candle flames flicker as though even fire itself recoiled. The case had broken something within him. He felt it as he sat alone in his room, staring at the diary, the half-burned words that taunted him. He thought of the letter slipped under his door, of the unseen footsteps, of the laughter in the night. He knew who the killer was, or at least he thought he did. But even in knowing, he realized something worse. To reveal the truth would destroy more than one life. It would shatter the fragile threads holding the village together. And so he whispered into the darkness, his voice low and steady. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The candle went out, and with it, the room fell into silence so complete that it felt as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Chapter 11. Father Brown discovers dangerous hidden evidence. They said the church was the safest place in the village, but when Father Brown pulled the cracked floorboard aside and found what lay hidden beneath, even he staggered backward as if he had touched the very pulse of evil. It began with a whisper, a rumor so slight that most dismissed it as gossip. Yet Father Brown, with his quiet patience, listened. There had been strange comings and goings at night, shadows moving around the rectory when the lamps were dim. No one admitted to seeing anything, but too many eyes looked away when he asked. A mystery seemed to curl itself into the very air of the parish, thick and suffocating. He could not yet name it, but he felt it, like the pressure before a storm. Something was concealed, buried close, terribly close. For days, the priest walked with the strange heaviness of knowledge unspoken. He did not know what he knew, but he knew it. The unease gnawed at him. Every face he passed in, the village seemed painted with an extra layer, a mask behind which guilt, fear, or knowledge was hidden. When he entered the church to pray, he felt the building itself breathe uneasily, as though its stones strained under the weight of secrets. He was right to be afraid, though he did not yet realize why. The first sign came in the form of a letter, unsigned, slipped beneath the vestry door at dawn. The ink was smudged, hurried, but the words struck like a dagger. "The proof is not destroyed. You will step on it before you see it. Do not look further, or you will not be spared." The threat was clear enough, but it was the choice of words that disturbed him most. Step on it before you see it. It suggested something buried, something underfoot, something closer than anyone dared imagine. That same evening, while kneeling alone in the sanctuary, Father Brown felt his knee brush against the old wooden floorboards. They had been worn by decades of parishioners' footsteps, smoothed by processions of children, confessions, and funerals. But one board felt wrong, slightly loose, raised just enough that the edge caught his cassock as he shifted. His heart tightened. He pressed his palm against it, and it shifted under his weight with a faint creak. He hesitated. He prayed. And then, with trembling fingers, he pried it open. What he saw beneath should have been impossible. Not gold, not jewels, not the bones of some forgotten grave, though bones would have been almost comforting in comparison. Instead, nestled in the dark soil, wrapped in cloth blackened with age and filth, lay a bundle that radiated menace. When he unwrapped it, just enough to glimpse inside, the air turned colder. Papers, letters, names, records of movements, of debts, of secrets. But more than that, something else, something small and metallic that glinted in the flickering candlelight. Evidence not only of crime, but of betrayal, the kind that destroys faith, families, entire lives. His hand shook so violently that he nearly dropped it, for Father Brown had seen many sins, many secrets, but this was not merely evidence of guilt. It was a weapon, the sort of evidence that kills not only by what it reveals, but by who would do anything to keep it hidden. Already footsteps echoed faintly outside the church. Someone knew he had found it. Someone had been waiting for this very moment. He concealed the bundle quickly, but not well enough, his mind racing with possibilities. Who had hidden it? Who wanted it kept hidden? Who had written the warning? Every villager, every friend, every face he thought he knew, suddenly twisted into masks of suspicion. The evidence was too dangerous for any one person to hold, and yet he, a simple priest, now carried it in his hands. The next day was worse. A neighbor greeted him with unusual cheer, but their eyes darted too quickly to the church floor. A young altar boy stumbled nervously when Father Brown mentioned prayer, as though he feared the priest already knew too much. Even his oldest friends seemed altered. Every handshake felt like a test. Every glance contained a shadow. Father Brown realized with dread that discovering the evidence had not solved the mystery. It had created one so deep that even he might drown in it. The bundle seemed almost alive. At night, he heard the rustle of papers, though it was locked in a drawer. He dreamt of the names written inside it, whispering, accusing, condemning. And worse, he began to realize that some of those names were not strangers. They belonged to the people who trusted him most, to the people who had smiled at him, wept to him, confessed their sins to him. What he held in his possession was not just evidence. It was betrayal, made tangible. One evening he dared to read further, and that was when he saw it. The first shocking betrayal. A name he could never have imagined. Someone so close, so trusted, that the very thought froze his blood. A secret sin, tied to something darker, something organized, deliberate. Not a mistake of passion, but a calculated crime. And yet, the papers did not explain everything. They only hinted, leaving gaps, contradictions. The more he read, the less he understood. Nothing fit. The betrayal was deeper than any single name. He could not burn it. He could not bury it again. And so he carried it with him, though each step felt heavier. as though the evidence itself was pulling him toward a truth no man should uncover. But the danger grew. He knew it because one night, as he returned to the rectory, he heard a whisper carried on the wind. "Put it back." He turned, but the street was empty. Another night, a stone shattered his window, and with it, a note. "You will not live to reveal it." Still, he pressed on, but his faith began to waver under the unbearable weight. Each piece of the puzzle contradicted the last, each clue leading him deeper into confusion. The evidence revealed so much, yet explained nothing. Who was guilty? Who was innocent? Perhaps none were. Perhaps all were. Perhaps that was the real horror, that the village he thought he knew was rotten to its very core. And then came the final terror, the one that nearly broke him. For hidden in the last page of the bundle, tucked so carefully he nearly missed it, was a confession. Not signed, but written in a hand he recognized. A confession that admitted to everything and yet revealed nothing, because it accused another, someone entirely unsuspected. The words twisted back on themselves, making truth indistinguishable from lie. By the time Father Brown lowered the page, his soul shook with the realization. The evidence itself had been planted not to reveal the truth, but to destroy anyone who touched it. It was a trap, and he had stepped straight into it. But the greatest trap of all was this. He now knew who had done it. He knew the betrayer, and yet he also knew he could never, ever reveal it. For the truth, if spoken, would shatter the very foundations of everything and everyone around him. The candle guttered out. The church fell silent, and Father Brown, in the suffocating darkness, whispered only one thing. "I know who it is, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. The final hour Father Brown watches. The clock struck midnight, and in that frozen silence, Father Brown realized the last hour of his life might not belong to him at all, but to the shadow that had been watching him from the darkness all along. The air seemed heavier than any chapel incense, pressing in around him as though time itself had become a predator, drawing closer with each tick of the clock's relentless hand. The village lay buried in sleep, but Father Brown knew he was not alone. Someone, somewhere, had chosen this exact hour to act, and whatever was coming was no mere test of reason or faith. It was something far more sinister, something that had been building for months, waiting for this precise moment when his heart would falter between truth and survival. The case began long before the midnight toll, in whispers and glances, in half-truths that slipped from lips pretending to confess, but only offering him riddles cloaked in prayer. A theft that had seemed almost mundane, a chalice gone missing, an old letter burned, spiraled into a sequence of events that pulled him deeper into a labyrinth of betrayal and silence. Every path he followed doubled back on itself. Every answer bled into another question. And now, standing alone in the dim light of the presbytery, he felt the sensation that someone had set the stage for him, not for justice, but for ruin. The mystery had grown too complex, too entangled with human sin, to even resemble a crime anymore. It was something larger, something constructed to unsettle him, to push him toward a truth so unbearable that even his priestly soul hesitated to confront it. He had always believed that every sin, no matter how grave, could be forgiven. But tonight he faced something darker, a secret that wanted not to be confessed, but to be buried forever, and anyone who approached it would vanish with it. As Father Brown searched, Each discovery brought more confusion than clarity. In the hollow floorboards, beneath the chapel vestry, he found scraps of paper scrawled with names he knew. Names of villagers, names of friends, even names of those long dead, each tied to sins no one had ever spoken aloud. But how could such knowledge exist? Who would keep a ledger of the village's darkest deeds, locked away like a black book of judgment? Was it a trick, a forgery designed to lead him astray, or was it proof that someone in this quiet parish had been watching everyone, collecting secrets like weapons? His hand trembled as he read, not out of fear for himself, but for the realization that every person he thought he knew could be guilty of something unimaginable. The first big reveal came when he noticed a pattern in the entries. The names weren't random. They followed a sequence, an order that pointed to a single conclusion. Someone had been building toward an endgame, choosing victims, weaving their sins together like threads in a tapestry that ended in blood. Each death, each disappearance, each strange occurrence in the village was not isolated. It was a chain, and that chain now circled him. For the first time in years, Father Brown felt the cold grip of dread in his chest, not for the safety of others, but for the thought that he himself might be the last link. The suspense tightened when he confronted those he trusted most. A word from a parishioner, a glance too sharp from a friend, a silence that lasted just a second too long. All of it planted doubt in his mind. Could betrayal hide so easily behind the faces he blessed every Sunday? He felt as if the whole village was collapsing into masks, each person performing innocence while concealing a dagger beneath their cloak. The closer he pressed, the less he knew. Evidence twisted against him. A handkerchief he had never seen before appeared in his own pocket, stained with something dark. A book he had never borrowed was discovered on his desk, its pages filled with notes in his own handwriting. Someone was staging the case so that the hunter would become the hunted. The priest was being turned into the suspect. By the time the truth glimmered faintly in the distance, he was no longer sure whether truth itself could save him. He found something hidden behind the church altar, something no one should ever have placed there. A box sealed with wax, smelling faintly of smoke. Inside were relics, not of God, but of crime. Torn photographs, a rosary soaked in red, a knife dulled from use. His breath caught because one of the photographs was of him. The knife, engraved faintly on the handle, carried his initials. The box wasn't evidence against another. It was evidence against him. Father Brown knew then that the case was not about solving a murder, but about erasing a man. The more he unraveled, the deeper he sank into the trap. Every path now pointed back to him. The dangerous evidence was not hidden from him, it was hidden for him, placed in the precise spots where he would stumble upon it, so that each discovery condemned him further. The conspiracy was not just outside, it had wormed its way into the very fabric of his life, twisting his faith, his friendships, even his sense of self. The village would not ask who was guilty. The village would see the evidence, and they would know. And when the final hour struck, Father Brown would be alone, accused by a crime he could never disprove. The cliffhanger came in the final minutes of that hour. Father Brown, clutching the sealed box, heard a knock at the presbytery door. It was not the timid knock of a parishioner, nor the heavy hand of a constable. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of knock meant to unnerve, to announce itself as a summons rather than a request. He froze, listening as the second knock followed, then a third. Whoever was outside already knew he was there, already knew what he held, already knew the trap was complete. His mind raced. Should he open the door, confront the shadow that had written his downfall, or should he hide the evidence, destroy it, risk the sin of silence to save himself? The clock struck again. The final hour was not just upon him. It was watching him, daring him to move. And in that dreadful moment, Father Brown whispered into the silence, not to the figure outside the door, but to God himself. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The knock sounded one last time. The door began to creak open, and Father Brown realized that whether or not he lived through this hour, his name would never leave the shadows untangled. The case had ended, but the story had only just begun.